To begin, we have the unbelievable story of the World War II prisoner of war Roger Bushell, the mastermind of the Great Escape. Roger Bushell was born in South Africa to British parents, in a family with ties to England's professional class and military traditions. His father was a mining engineer, and the family's background provided a stable, well-educated environment. Though born on another continent, Roger was very much shaped by Britain, as his family returned there during his youth. He attended some of England's most respected schools, displaying intelligence, discipline, and a gift for languages. He was fluent in French and German, a skill that would become vital later in life. His education culminated in studies at Cambridge University, where he read law. While there, he excelled not only academically but in sport. Roger Bushell was especially known for his skill as a skier. He became captain of the Cambridge ski team and was so talented that he earned a reputation on the European circuit. He raced in competitions in the Alps and trained with leading teams. His love for the mountains and his physical prowess shaped him into someone both determined and at ease with risk, qualities that would mark his wartime career. After graduating, he became a barrister at Lincoln's Inn, beginning a promising legal career. But even before the war, he was drawn to military service, joining the Royal Auxiliary Air Force. He trained as a pilot, committing himself to aviation at a time when tensions in Europe were unmistakably growing. When the Second World War broke out, Roger Bushell was already a trained fighter pilot. He flew with the Royal Air Force, piloting Spitfires with the No. 92 Squadron. He was known for being charismatic and decisive, a man other pilots admired and trusted. His fluency in European languages made him especially useful in intelligence discussions about the enemy. On one of his early missions over occupied France, Bushell's plane was shot down. Forced to bail out behind enemy lines, he was captured almost immediately and became a prisoner of war. This marked the start of a new phase of his life, one that would define his legacy. Bushell's first captivity was in France, where he quickly attempted escape. Using his German skills and his knowledge of European routes, he planned to reach neutral territory. He was recaptured before he could cross into safety, but this would not be his last attempt. Transferred deeper into Germany, he was held at several prisoner-of-war camps. He quickly became notorious among German guards and camp authorities for organizing escapes. At one camp, he masterminded an operation that saw him and other prisoners escape through a tunnel. For Bushell, escaping was not just about personal freedom, it was an obligation. He believed it was a duty for officers to try to tie up enemy resources and to maintain the morale and fighting spirit of captured men. He was caught again, moved to camps with tighter security, and continued plotting. His reputation spread among prisoners. Many saw him as the natural leader for any escape attempt, someone with both vision and the force of personality to inspire others. The Germans eventually transferred him to Stalag Luft III, a specially built Luftwaffe-run prisoner-of-war camp in what is now Poland, designed to be escape-proof. Stalag Luft III had higher fences, raised barracks to expose tunnels, and a layout calculated to make escape impossible. The German command believed they could finally contain men like Bushell there. But Roger Bushell saw the camp's challenges as another puzzle to solve. He was appointed as the head of the escape committee for British officers. He quickly began planning what would become the largest and most ambitious escape operation of the entire war. His plan was simple in concept, but almost unimaginably complex in execution. They would dig not one but 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, so that if one was discovered, work could continue on the others. The scale of the project was staggering. Hundreds of men were involved. Tunnels needed to be ventilated, shored up with stolen wood, and camouflaged to hide dirt. Clothes were altered to civilian styles, forged documents produced, and a whole clandestine organisation developed to manage security and resources. Bushell was uncompromising about security. He enforced strict rules on who knew about the tunnels and how information was compartmentalised. He was determined to get out not just a few men, but 200. His vision was to cause chaos behind German lines by flooding the countryside with escapees. He believed this would tie up enemy troops, forcing them to search for fugitives and diverting resources from the front. Despite repeated setbacks, collapses, betrayals, inspections, the work went on. Tunnels were discovered and destroyed, but they kept digging. Eventually, one tunnel, Harry, was completed. The night of the escape arrived. In the darkness, 76 men made it out through Harry before the breakout was discovered. Snow on the ground, the narrowness of the tunnel exit, and logistical delays meant that fewer men got out than Bushell had hoped. Still, it was one of the largest mass escapes from a German prisoner of war camp in the war. Roger Bushell himself was among those who crawled through the claustrophobic tunnel and fled into the night. He and fellow escapee Bernard Scheidhauer, a French pilot, made their way by train using forged documents, heading toward the occupied Netherlands in hopes of linking with resistance networks. But they were caught while travelling by the Gestapo. Their false papers were detected during a routine inspection. Arrested, they were held briefly for questioning. Here the story turns grim. Adolf Hitler, furious at the scale of the escape and the embarrassment it caused, personally ordered a brutal reprisal. Against all rules of war and Geneva Convention protections for POWs, Hitler directed that 50 of the recaptured escapees be executed as a warning. Roger Bushell was among those selected. He and Scheidhauer were taken from custody, driven to a remote location by the Gestapo, and shot. Their bodies were cremated. The Germans tried to present these murders as shot while trying to escape, but the truth was clear to everyone. News of the murders spread among the POW community, devastating morale but also hardening resolve. After the war, Allied investigators painstakingly tracked down many of the Gestapo officers involved in the executions. Trials were held and several were convicted and executed for war crimes. Roger Bushell's legacy rests not only on his death but on his extraordinary leadership. He had built an entire underground organisation inside the camp, enforced discipline, and convinced men facing captivity and despair to believe in a goal larger than themselves. His plan did succeed in tying up German resources, sparking massive manhunts across Europe. He became known simply as Big X, the codename he used within the escape committee. In post-war Britain and among former prisoners of war, his legend grew. The story of the Great Escape was immortalised in books and in the famous film, where his role inspired the character played by Richard Attenborough. He's remembered as a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and unbreakable will. A trained lawyer, a champion skier, an RAF officer, and ultimately a leader of men in the most testing of circumstances, Roger Bushell lived a life marked by restless energy and a refusal to surrender. His name remains forever tied to one of the most daring escape efforts of the Second World War, an act of defiance carried out in the face of overwhelming odds. Next, we have Frank Morris, the man who escaped Alcatraz. Frank Morris was born into a world that seemed determined to push him to the margins. He grew up in Washington, D.C., in circumstances marked by neglect and abandonment. From an early age he had no steady parental guidance and found himself shuffled between foster homes and juvenile detention facilities. The institutions where he was placed became more familiar to him than any family home ever could. This instability defined his formative years. He became known to authorities as a problem child, difficult to control, quick to run away, and often involved in petty theft. But even then, people noticed something remarkable about him. Intelligence tests administered during his stays in various juvenile facilities revealed that he was unusually bright. Reports described him as having an IQ well above average, a mind that was clever, analytical, and good at solving problems. As he aged into his late teens and early adulthood, Frank Morris's life took on a grim predictability. He graduated from minor crimes to more serious offences. He developed a specialty in burglary and armed robbery. Despite multiple arrests, he was adept at slipping through legal cracks, sometimes escaping from local jails before serving his full sentences. By this period, his criminal record had grown into something serious enough to draw federal attention. He became notorious not just for the crimes themselves, but for his repeated ability to break free from custody. This earned him a reputation among law enforcement as an escape risk, someone whose mind worked tirelessly to spot weaknesses in the system. Eventually, his criminal activities led him to Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola. There he didn't fade quietly into a routine. Instead, he escaped, proving once again that confinement was a problem he viewed as solvable. He was caught after about a year on the run, demonstrating both his ability to survive outside the law and the relentlessness of the authorities determined to bring him back. His record of repeated escapes made him a perfect candidate for the federal government's ultimate prison for unmanageable inmates, Alcatraz. Perched on an island in San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz was designed to be escape-proof. The philosophy was simple. If someone couldn't be contained anywhere else, they'd be sent there. When he arrived, Frank Morris was described as quiet, disciplined, and observant. He kept to himself, studying routines and the environment, with the same meticulous eye that had always served him. He wasn't the type to pick fights or draw attention. Instead, he was patient, deliberate, and intelligent. Exactly the kind of man who would make a plan that could actually work. In Alcatraz, he found like-minded collaborators in John and Clarence Anglin, two brothers from Georgia who'd spent their lives in and out of prison, and Alan West, another inmate with his own history of crime and attempted escapes. Over time, these men developed a bond rooted in a single shared goal. They wouldn't die on that island. Together they began to hatch what would become one of the most famous prison break plots in history. For months they studied the concrete walls of their cells and realized they could exploit a flaw. The salt-laden air in San Francisco Bay had eroded the prison's aging structures. The ventilation grills in their cells weren't as secure as they appeared. Frank Morris took on the role of leader, orchestrating the schedule and delegating work. The team slowly chipped away at the walls using improvised tools: a spoon, an electric drill motor fashioned from a vacuum cleaner. They worked only during hours when the prison band was playing to mask the noise. They constructed realistic dummy heads out of soap, toothpaste, toilet paper, and hair from the barbershop to fool the guards during bed checks. They also designed a raft and life preservers from raincoats, hundreds of them, stitched and sealed with heat from the prison's steam pipes. Every step was rehearsed and planned meticulously. Failure would mean not only certain capture but solitary confinement in Alcatraz's notorious D block, a place designed to break spirits. Finally, on the night they chose for the escape, the plan unfolded with precision. Frank Morris, the Anglin brothers, and Alan West were supposed to slip through the holes they dug into the utility corridor, climb up a service pipe to the roof, cross to the bayside, and use the raft to make their way to freedom. Alan West couldn't make it out of his cell in time. His hole was too narrow, and by the time he tried to enlarge it, the others were gone. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers reached the roof, climbed down a vent pipe, crossed the fence, and disappeared into the darkness of San Francisco Bay. By morning, their absence was discovered. Guards found the dummy heads in their beds and sounded the alarm. The search was immediate and intense. The FBI launched an investigation, combing the shoreline, the currents, and the tides. They found personal belongings in the water and remnants of the raft on nearby Angel Island, but no bodies. For years, the official position was that they drowned. The bay's waters are frigid, the current swift, and the crossing treacherous even for skilled swimmers. Yet doubts persisted. The Anglin family claimed they received unsigned postcards and photographs suggesting the brothers survived. In later years, a letter surfaced allegedly from Frank Morris himself, claiming he had lived out his life in secret and wanted to negotiate his return for medical care. The FBI kept the case open for decades, officially closing it after many years, but leaving the possibility open in public statements that survival was plausible. The escape became legend. It was immortalized in books and in the film Escape from Alcatraz, where Clint Eastwood portrayed Frank Morris as the embodiment of quiet, determined defiance. No conclusive evidence ever proved Frank Morris's fate. Did he make it to shore? Did he start a new life in South America, as rumours suggested? Or did he vanish into the bay, taken by the cold and the dark? His entire life was shaped by movement, from institution to institution, from cell to cell, always looking for the weakness in the walls that held him. His escape from Alcatraz was the culmination of that restless, brilliant and troubled spirit. Whether he died that night or lived on in hiding, Frank Morris remains a symbol of the eternal human urge to break free. Next, we have the man who escaped Auschwitz, Alfred Wetzler. Alfred Wetzler was born in a corner of Europe that was always shifting beneath people's feet. He came into the world in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in a region inhabited by Slovaks, Hungarians, Jews, and many others who had lived through decades of turmoil. His family was Jewish and of modest means, living in a society that was increasingly marked by tension and change. He grew up speaking multiple languages common in the region, Slovak, Hungarian, and German, reflecting the cultural complexity of his homeland. He was an intelligent, observant child, part of a tight-knit Jewish community. His early life was typical of so many young Jews in Central Europe at the time, marked by tradition, faith, and family, yet also by a growing unease as anti-Semitic sentiment spread. As a young man, he worked in various trades. He was employed as a clerk and later as a labourer. He wasn't wealthy or prominent, but he was known among friends as quick-witted and determined. When the winds of war began to blow across Europe, Alfred's life changed in the way it did for so many Jews in Czechoslovakia. Anti-Jewish laws restricted where he could work, where he could live, and what rights he had at all. He found himself gradually shut out of normal life. When Slovakia became a client state of Nazi Germany, anti-Jewish measures intensified. Jewish men were targeted for deportation under the guise of labour service. But the truth of these transports was increasingly clear to those paying attention. Alfred Wetzler was among those deported. He was captured and eventually transported to Auschwitz, the most notorious of the Nazi camps. There, he became just another number, forced to strip away his name and identity. Prisoners were tattooed, assigned labour, and subjected to a brutal regime designed to break them physically and mentally. But he was not someone easily broken. He observed everything around him. He watched new arrivals come in on transports. He worked in jobs that gave him grim insight into the workings of the camp, including stints where he saw the flow of prisoners being selected, processed and murdered in gas chambers. In Auschwitz, Alfred Wetzler met Rudolf Weber, another Slovak Jew with a keen mind and determination not to die behind the barbed wire. The two men became close friends. Over time, they began to talk in whispers about escape, not merely to save themselves, but to tell the world what was happening. They understood that most people outside had no idea of the industrial scale of murder taking place in the camp. Escape from Auschwitz was considered nearly impossible. The Nazis had surrounded the camp with electrified fences, guard towers, and a brutal system of collective punishment designed to deter any attempts. If a prisoner escaped, the SS would kill 10 others from his block as a lesson. But Alfred and Rudolf believed they could find a way. They studied the camp's routines for months, They chose a time when security would be focused elsewhere during a major holiday period. They prepared a hiding place in a woodpile just beyond the inner perimeter, where they lay motionless for days. The Germans mounted frantic searches, but after the required number of days without discovery, the escape alarm was cancelled, assuming they were dead or long gone. Once the immediate danger was over, they crept out under cover of darkness and began the long, perilous journey on foot. They travelled hundreds of kilometres through Nazi-occupied territory. They relied on peasant sympathisers, false identities, and sheer determination to survive. Hunger and exhaustion were constant enemies, but they refused to turn back. When they finally reached Slovakia, they found refuge with Jewish and anti-fascist contacts. But they didn't stop there. They sat down with members of the Slovak Jewish Council and dictated everything they had seen inside Auschwitz. They described the layout of the camp, the gas chambers and crematoria, the arrival procedures, the selection process, and the scale of murder. Tens of thousands of Jews arriving and being killed week after week. Their testimony was compiled into what became known as the Wetzler Report. This document was smuggled out, translated, and distributed to Allied governments and Jewish leaders. It became one of the earliest and most detailed eyewitness accounts of the Auschwitz killing process to reach the outside world. While the Allies debated their response, the report had a very real impact. News of the mass murders reached Hungarian Jews just as Germany began its plan to deport them en masse. There is strong historical evidence that the warnings slowed the deportations and may have saved tens of thousands of lives by pushing for diplomatic pressure on Hungary's leaders to stop cooperating. After making his report, Alfred Wetzler didn't fade away quietly. He joined the Slovak partisans fighting against the Nazi occupation. He lived in the forests, surviving brutal conditions and combat, determined to fight back against the regime that had tried to kill him and his people. When the war ended, Alfred found himself in a liberated but devastated Europe. He returned to civilian life in Czechoslovakia. He tried to rebuild, as so many did, though he carried the weight of what he'd seen forever. He married and took on a new name, Józef Lanik, hoping to build some form of ordinary life. He worked in various jobs. He wrote. He tried to explain to the world what had happened. He published a memoir that laid out his experiences, a testament to survival, but also a warning about what human cruelty can achieve when it goes unchecked. He was not the kind of man to speak with dramatic flair. His style was direct, careful, factual. He wanted people to understand the machinery of genocide so it could never be denied or forgotten. Despite his extraordinary wartime heroism, Alfred Wetzler was not widely celebrated for much of his life. Communist Czechoslovakia had little interest in promoting stories of Jewish suffering, and his anti-fascist credentials were not enough to overcome suspicion about survivors who had witnessed the failures of the pre-war state. He lived modestly, working in commerce and local industries. He was sometimes recognized among scholars and Jewish organizations, but never became famous in the way some Holocaust witnesses did. Yet historians have pointed out that his and Rudolf Weber's testimony remains one of the most important early accounts of the Holocaust, a document that provided irrefutable, detailed evidence of the systematic murder happening at Auschwitz. Through it all, Alfred Wetzler remained who he had always been, quiet, precise, stubbornly determined to do what he thought was right. He lived the rest of his life in Slovakia. He died in relative obscurity, leaving behind the unshakable legacy of a man who risked everything to tell the truth. He's remembered today as one of the few who not only survived Auschwitz, but managed to escape, to warn the world, and to make a record that stands as one of the earliest proofs of the unimaginable. His life was not marked by wealth or fame, but by the kind of moral courage that few possess, the courage to look horror in the face, survive it, and then speak so that others might live. Next, we have Henri Charrière. the man who escaped from Devil's Island. Henri Charrière was born in 1906 in the rugged region of southern France known as Ardèche. His family lived in a small village in the mountains, and he grew up surrounded by rural traditions and a strong sense of local identity. From a young age, he was known for his restless spirit, quick temper, and stubborn independence. His father worked as a schoolteacher, giving Henri access to a basic education. He learned to read and write well enough to express himself, but formal schooling never truly tamed him. He preferred adventure and risk to the confines of a classroom. By the time he was in his late teens, he had drifted toward a life on the fringes of society. He joined the French Navy for a time, finding some measure of discipline and purpose, but military life could not contain him. He was discharged and returned to civilian life, where he moved to Paris. In the capital, he immersed himself in the city's underworld, working in clubs, gambling halls, and among petty criminals. He became known for a charismatic personality, quick wit, and a willingness to fight. During these years, he built a reputation in Parisian nightlife as someone tough but sociable, able to make friends quickly and hold grudges just as easily. He earned the nickname Papillon, French for butterfly, because of the butterfly tattoo he wore on his chest, a symbol that would follow him for the rest of his life. His entire world changed when he was arrested and charged with the murder of Roland Legrand, a Parisian pimp with underworld connections. Henri Charrière always maintained his innocence, claiming he'd been framed. He insisted that the police pin the crime on him to clear the case quickly, relying on thin evidence and underworld rumours. Despite his protestations, he was convicted in a high-profile trial. The French justice system sentenced him to life in forced labour, to be served in the infamous penal colonies of French Guiana, one of the harshest punishments in the French Empire. Transported across the Atlantic in a prison ship, he joined hundreds of other convicts sent to rot in the tropics. The French penal colonies were notorious for their brutality, disease, and death rates. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion in sweltering conditions, exposed to malaria and yellow fever, and subjected to cruel punishments for any infraction. Henri Charrière was sent first to the main camp on the mainland at Saint-Laurent-du-Maroni. From there, prisoners could be dispatched to smaller, harsher camps, including the feared Île du Salut, Salvation Islands, of which Devil's Island was the most notorious. Charrière quickly established himself as someone impossible to break. He refused to accept the authority of guards and administrators and plotted escape constantly. He made repeated attempts, some carefully planned, others opportunistic. In his telling, these included bribing local fishermen, building makeshift rafts, and forging alliances with other convicts. One of his most famous escape attempts involved fleeing in a small boat with other prisoners along the coast, and eventually making contact with indigenous peoples in the region. He claimed to have lived for a time with local tribes, marrying a woman and adopting their customs before being recaptured or forced to flee again. He spent long periods in solitary confinement, punishment for escape attempts, fighting, or defiance. Solitary in French Guiana was a brutal sentence. Prisoners were locked in tiny dark cells, often chained, with minimal food and almost no human contact. Many went mad. Henri survived it more than once, further cementing his reputation as unbreakable. Over the years, he was transferred among various camps in the system. He described in detail the cruelty of the guards, the corruption of officials, and the horrifying conditions in which men died by disease, suicide, or violence. He also told of moments of friendship among prisoners, solidarity against their common tormentors, and the will to survive at any cost. His most famous escape, the one that made his name legendary, involved constructing a sort of raft from sacks filled with coconuts, which he claimed allowed him to float across the treacherous currents away from the island. In his memoir, he described this escape as successful, saying he reached mainland South America and eventually made his way to freedom. After leaving the penal colony behind, he eventually settled in Venezuela. There he built a new life, far from the land of his birth. He worked in various trades, including as a miner and a restaurant owner. Unlike many convicts who vanished into obscurity or died in the jungle, Charrière carved out a stable existence. He married a Venezuelan woman, started a family, and lived as a respected citizen. Decades later, he began writing down his experiences. The result was Papillon, a memoir published in the late 1960s that became an international sensation. The book presented a vivid, dramatic, and harrowing account of life in the French penal system, filled with colourful characters, desperate violence, and repeated ingenious escapes. Papillon was marketed as a true story, Charrière's personal testimony of injustice, survival, and relentless defiance. The public loved it. He became famous, interviewed on television, and celebrated as the man who beat the Devil's Island system. However, historians and journalists began to question the strict factual accuracy of his book. Evidence suggested that while Henri Charrière undoubtedly served time in the French Guiana prison system and escaped, many of the episodes he described might have been borrowed from other prisoners' stories or elaborated for dramatic effect. Records indicated that he might never have served time on Devil's Island itself, instead spending most of his sentence in other camps. Despite these doubts, Papillon captured imaginations worldwide. It was translated into numerous languages and adapted into a major Hollywood film starring Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman. The movie further enshrined the legend of Henri Charrière as the indomitable escape artist who would not be caged. In his later years, Charrière enjoyed the fruits of his literary fame. He published a sequel, Banco, which told of his life in Venezuela, efforts to find his fortune, and his reflections on freedom and redemption. He used the money from his books and film rights to live comfortably, something few former convicts of the French penal colonies ever achieved. Toward the end of his life, he returned briefly to France, welcomed as something of a folk hero despite the controversies about the truthfulness of his memoir. He remained charismatic, enjoying the role of the outlaw-turned-author who had outsmarted one of the harshest penal systems ever devised. He died in Spain, far from the jungles and prison walls that had once defined him. His life remains a study in contradictions, a convicted murderer who insisted on his innocence, a brutalized prisoner who may have exaggerated or borrowed stories, yet undeniably someone who survived a nightmarish system and brought its horrors to worldwide attention. Whether every word he wrote was true or not, Henri Charrière gave the world an indelible portrait of human endurance, defiance, and the primal desire for freedom. Next, we have the great escape artist Jack Shepard. Jack Shepard was born in England at the turn of the 18th century, in London's bustling but impoverished quarters. His early life was marked by hardship. His father died when Jack was still a small child, leaving the family in severe poverty. His mother struggled to support him and his siblings in the grim conditions of London's East End. London at this time was a city of contrasts. Wealth and grandeur on one side, crime-ridden slums on the other. It was in these overcrowded, dangerous streets that Jack grew up, exposed early to the underworld of thieves, fences, and taverns. Despite his circumstances, Jack showed promise. As a boy, he was apprenticed to a carpenter. This was considered a lucky break for someone of his class, offering a path to a stable, honest trade. He learned the skills of joinery and carpentry well. He was intelligent, deft with his hands, and creative. For a time, he was known as a good worker, but the temptations of London's criminal world were everywhere. He began frequenting alehouses, mixing with thieves, prostitutes, and fences. Among these contacts was Elizabeth Lyon, known as Edgeworth Bess, a woman with a criminal reputation who became his lover and accomplice. As he fell deeper into this crowd, Jack abandoned his carpentry apprenticeship. He turned to burglary and theft. Initially, his crimes were small-scale, picking pockets, breaking into shops, robbing houses, but he quickly gained notoriety for his boldness and his willingness to take risks that others avoided. He joined a criminal gang led by the thief Jonathan Wild, who was infamous in London as the so-called thief-taker general. Wild pretended to fight crime, but in reality ran a vast network of thieves and fences, turning in rivals to the authorities while protecting his own people for a cut of their profits. Jack's refusal to fully submit to Wild's control eventually set the two at odds, a rivalry that would shape Jack's fate. Jack's crimes brought him to the attention of the authorities. He was first arrested for burglary after being identified by victims and informants, but it was what he did after arrest that made him a legend. He was imprisoned at St Giles's Roundhouse, a local lockup. Showing remarkable ingenuity, he managed to escape. He cut through his restraints, forced open the door, and slipped away into the London night. This first escape gave him a taste of his own legend. He was captured again, and this time placed in New Prison in Clerkenwell, a more secure facility. But Jack was determined not to stay. He worked with Edgeworth Bess, who smuggled in tools. Using files and his carpenter's knowledge, he managed to remove the irons from his legs. He then broke through doors, climbed over walls, and escaped once more, along with Bess herself. His escapes thrilled the London public, who loved stories of an underdog outwitting the authorities. Broadsheets and pamphlets spread the tales, turning him into a folk hero. The authorities were humiliated, and Jonathan Wild took it personally. Wild used his vast network of informers to hunt Jack down. Captured again, Jack faced even tighter security. He was placed in Newgate Prison, the most notorious jail in London, in the condemned hold awaiting execution. But even here, he was not finished. In one of the most famous prison breaks in English history, he escaped yet again. Inside Newgate, he managed to loosen iron bars, break through 6 locked doors, and even remove a massive iron bar by sawing it apart. He climbed chimneys, forced doors with stolen tools, and made his way onto the prison roof. From there he scaled down using sheets tied together as ropes, disappearing into the city. This escape was so audacious that it became the talk of the entire city. Londoners cheered him on, seeing him as a working-class hero resisting corrupt authorities. But this fame made him an even bigger target. Jonathan Wild redoubled his efforts. Jack, now a celebrity criminal, tried to lay low but could not resist showing off his freedom in taverns and streets where he was recognised. Eventually he was betrayed by informants and captured again. This time the authorities were determined he would not escape. He was shackled heavily, placed in the most secure cell in Newgate and kept under close watch. Even so, he attempted one last escape by filing through his chains and trying to break his cell door, but he was caught before he could finish. He was finally tried and sentenced to death. On the day of his execution at Tyburn, the crowds were immense. Thousands came to see the man who had defied the law time and again. It was said the city had rarely seen such a spectacle. Legend holds that Jack hoped someone in the crowd would cut him down quickly after the hanging so he could be revived, a practice sometimes attempted in those days. But if there was such a plan, it failed. Jack Shepard was hanged, ending the brief but spectacular career of England's most famous escape artist. After his death, his legend only grew. Plays and ballads told of his daring. Writers and historians debated whether he was simply a criminal or a folk hero fighting a corrupt system. His life became a cautionary tale about crime, but also an enduring story of defiance and ingenuity. Jack Shepard remains one of the most celebrated escape artists in history, a young man from the London slums who outwitted some of the most secure prisons of his day, using little more than nerve, skill, and unbreakable will. Moving along, we have the oldest escapee we will talk about today from the 13th century. But this escape has a bit of a twist to it. His name was Gruffydd. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn Fawr was born into the complex shifting world of medieval Wales. He was the eldest son of Llywelyn the Great, one of the most powerful Welsh princes of his age, who sought to unite the fractious principalities and secure Welsh independence in the face of English expansion. Gruffydd's mother was Tangwystel, who is sometimes described as Llywelyn's consort rather than his wife, a distinction that would shape Gruffydd's standing and fate. From childhood, Gruffydd lived in the long shadow of his father's ambition and political manoeuvring. Llywelyn the Great worked tirelessly to strengthen his rule over Gwynedd and extend his influence throughout Wales. But for the dynasty, legitimacy was a crucial question. Gruffydd was the eldest son, but considered illegitimate under church law. Meanwhile, Llywelyn had married Joan, the legitimate daughter of King John of England, and their son Dafydd was recognised as legitimate in the eyes of both church and crown. This question of legitimacy would haunt Gruffydd all his life. While he was his father's firstborn and clearly intended to rule part of the realm, he was seen as a rival to his half-brother Dafydd for the main inheritance. The political landscape was unforgiving. Welsh succession traditions allowed division of lands among sons, but the growing influence of English law favoured primogeniture and legitimacy, giving Dafydd an edge in his father's planning. Despite this, Gruffydd was not excluded from power. He was granted lands within Gwynedd, and there is evidence that he helped govern parts of the principality under his father's authority. He had a reputation for boldness and martial skill, essential qualities for a Welsh prince expected to lead men in battle and defend territory against both neighbouring Welsh rivals and English encroachment. Gruffydd was not content to accept a subordinate role. He was ambitious, proud, and unwilling to let his half-brother claim all of Gwynedd without contest. Tensions between the brothers simmered during their father's life. Llywelyn the Great worked to hold the family together and secure a clear line of succession, pressing the English crown to recognise Dafydd as his heir. He sought papal approval for this plan, reinforcing Dafydd's legitimacy and, in effect, sidelining Gruffydd. When Llywelyn the Great died, these fragile arrangements unravelled. Dafydd ap Llywelyn took control of Gwynedd as planned, styling himself the sole ruler. Gruffydd, however, resisted this claim. He had support among those who favoured the older, traditional Welsh custom of dividing lands among sons, and from nobles dissatisfied with Dafydd's alliance with English interests. Conflict broke out between the brothers. Gruffydd challenged Dafydd's rule, leading to civil strife within Gwynedd. Though records from the time are fragmentary, it is clear that Gruffydd raised forces and sought allies to press his claim. He represented the older native tradition, while Dafydd relied more on English support and legal arguments about legitimacy. Eventually, Dafydd succeeded in capturing Gruffydd. He imprisoned him in harsh conditions to eliminate his threat. This imprisonment within Wales was not enough to settle matters, though, because the English king, Henri III, saw opportunity in the brothers' rivalry. Henri III intervened in Welsh affairs, exploiting the internal divisions. Dafydd was forced to negotiate with the English crown, and as part of these negotiations, Gruffydd was handed over to Henry's custody. This transfer was a calculated move. For Dafydd, it removed his brother from local politics and made him the king's problem. For Henry, it provided a valuable bargaining chip to keep pressure on Dafydd. Gruffydd was taken to England and imprisoned in the Tower of London. There, he became a political pawn. Henri III hoped to use him to destabilise Dafydd's rule in Wales. The plan was clear: threaten to release Gruffydd back into Wales to challenge his brother unless Dafydd made concessions to the English crown. Gruffydd's value lay in his potential as a rival claimant. But Gruffydd refused to be a passive tool in this game. Imprisoned in the tower, he plotted escape. He is said to have been held in a particularly secure part of the fortress, recognising that he was a high-value prisoner. The Tower of London was among the most formidable prisons in England at the time, its walls thick, its guards vigilant. Yet even there, Gruffydd sought freedom. he and his companions attempted an audacious escape by climbing down from their cell, using a makeshift rope of knotted sheets or clothing. The plan required nerve, ingenuity, and desperation in equal measure, and tragically, the attempt failed in the most catastrophic way. Gruffydd's improvised rope broke under his weight, sending him plunging to his death within the tower grounds. His sudden, violent end closed a life marked by conflict, rivalry, and defiance. Gruffydd's death had immediate political consequences. Without him as a rival, Dafydd's position in Gwynedd was temporarily more secure. But the deeper issue of English interference in Welsh affairs was far from resolved. Henry III's strategy of divide and rule continued, and the tensions that Gruffydd's life had embodied did not die with him. His sons carried on his claim. Notably, his son Llywelyn ap Gruffydd would eventually rise to power, known as Llywelyn the Last, fighting fiercely to maintain Welsh independence before falling to English conquest. The struggle between Welsh self-rule and English dominance continued for generations. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn Fawr remains a vivid figure in this long saga, the ambitious eldest son who challenged both family and foreign power, who refused to accept subordination, and who died making a desperate bid for freedom in England's most famous fortress. His life tells of a Wales divided by family rivalries, pressured by outside forces, and defined by a relentless spirit that resisted conquest even in the face of overwhelming odds. Next, we have the 17th century escape of Hugo de Groot. Hugo de Groot was born in the Dutch Republic, in a time when the Low Countries were undergoing profound change. The Dutch were fighting for independence from Spanish rule, and the cultural, scientific, and economic life of the region was flourishing in what would become known as the Dutch Golden Age. He was born into a prominent and well-educated family in Delft. His father, Jan de Groot, was a respected scholar and municipal official, deeply interested in humanist learning. From an early age, Hugo was recognized as a prodigy. He displayed an extraordinary memory, a love of classical literature, and an ability to master languages with ease. He was sent to study at the University of Leiden while still very young, astonishing professors with his brilliance. Before he was even a teenager, he was reading Latin and Greek fluently, writing learned essays and debating theology and law. His mind absorbed vast amounts of knowledge, philosophy, jurisprudence, poetry, history, all of which would serve him in later life. As a young man, Hugo de Groot quickly earned a reputation across Europe as one of the most learned scholars of his age. He was noticed by leading figures in the Dutch struggle for independence and invited to serve on diplomatic missions. He worked with Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the powerful Grand Pensionary of Holland, who became his mentor and patron. Hugo's early legal writings were already groundbreaking. He drafted treatises on maritime law that would influence international law for centuries. His most famous concept, the idea of mare liberum, the freedom of the seas, argued that no nation could claim dominion over the open ocean, an argument designed to support Dutch trade against Portuguese and Spanish monopolies. But Hugo was not simply an academic writing from an ivory tower. He was drawn deeply into the political and religious conflicts that divided the young Dutch Republic. On one side was the faction supporting Oldenbarnevelt, advocating for provincial autonomy and a more tolerant approach to religious divisions within Protestantism. On the other side was the faction backing Prince Maurice of Nassau, pushing for greater central control and religious orthodoxy. Hugo aligned himself with Oldenbarnevelt's camp. He supported the Remonstrants, a group of Dutch Protestants who called for a more moderate Calvinism and greater religious toleration. This stance, though principled, would prove dangerous. The political conflict escalated into open power struggles, trials, and executions. When Prince Maurice moved to consolidate his power, Oldenbarnevelt was arrested, tried, and executed for treason. Hugo de Groot was also targeted. He was accused of treasonable activities, primarily because of his legal defences of religious toleration and provincial rights against the centralising ambitions of Maurice. He was tried before a special court packed with his political enemies. Despite his brilliance and the respect he commanded as a scholar, the verdict was predetermined. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was confined to Loevestein Castle, a fortress prison in the Dutch countryside. Isolated from his family, surrounded by cold stone walls, he nevertheless refused to surrender to despair. He continued to write, studying theology and law, composing poetry and planning for freedom. His imprisonment became famous not simply for its injustice, but for the ingenious manner of his escape. Hugo's wife, Maria van Rijgersberg, was allowed to live with him in the castle. She supported him with unshakable loyalty, helping smuggle books into his cell in a large chest. Over time, the guards grew accustomed to the heavy chest filled with books coming and going without inspection. Hugo and Maria realized this could be the key to his freedom. They prepared a daring plan. On the chosen day, Hugo curled himself tightly into the chest, enduring the cramped, suffocating space, while Maria calmly instructed the guards to carry it out, claiming it was filled as usual with his library. Unquestioning, the guards carried the chest out of the castle and loaded it onto a boat bound for a safe location. Once clear of the prison, Hugo emerged from hiding and fled, eventually making his way to safety. He crossed into the Spanish Netherlands and ultimately found refuge in France, where he was welcomed as a great legal mind and given protection by Cardinal Richelieu. Though in exile, he refused to waste his freedom. He resumed writing with extraordinary energy, producing some of the most influential works in the history of law and philosophy. His most famous work, De Jure Belliac Paces, translating to On the Law of War and Peace, attempted to set down universal principles governing warfare and diplomacy. In this treatise, Hugo Grotius argued that natural law bound all nations and peoples, regardless of custom or religion. He laid the foundations for modern international law, insisting that even in war there were rules to limit cruelty and protect civilians. His ideas spread across Europe. Statesmen, philosophers, and jurists studied his arguments. Over time, his principles helped shape diplomatic practice, treaties, and even the formation of modern international institutions. But Hugo's personal fortunes remained uncertain. He spent years in France, receiving pensions and working as Sweden's ambassador in Paris. Though he hoped to return to the Dutch Republic, the political climate there remained hostile. His writings were banned in his homeland for years, his reputation tarnished by partisans who remembered his opposition to Maurice of Nassau. He maintained a vast correspondence with scholars and leaders across Europe, discussing philosophy, theology, and law. His letters reveal a man of restless intellect, fierce conviction, and occasional bitterness at his exile. In the final phase of his life, he accepted a diplomatic posting in Sweden. Though aging and often ill, he continued to serve as an advisor, drawing on his unparalleled knowledge of European law and politics. After leaving Sweden to return to Germany, he was shipwrecked on the Baltic coast. Exhausted and ill from exposure, he died far from his native Netherlands, a scholar without a true homeland at the end. Despite his death in exile, his legacy only grew. Generations of lawyers, philosophers, and statesmen came to see him as the father of international law. His insistence that nations must recognize universal principles of justice and human rights laid the groundwork for later treaties, conventions, and global institutions. Hugo de Groot, remembered to history as Hugo Grotius, lived a life marked by brilliance, controversy, political betrayal, and enduring influence. From a child prodigy reading Latin verse before most boys could write, to a prisoner escaping in a book chest, to the author of works that shaped the moral framework of nations, his story is that of a man who refused to surrender to either chains or silence. Next, we have the infamous story of Billy the Kid. While more known for being an outlaw in general, his escapes were a big part of what made him so infamous. Billy the Kid was born as Henry McCarty in the rough shifting world of mid-19th century America. He likely entered the world in New York City, but little about his early years is clear or firmly documented. His family situation was poor and unstable. After his father's death or disappearance, his mother moved west with Henry and his brother, seeking opportunity wherever they could find it. They eventually settled in the New Mexico Territory, part of the American frontier that was only loosely governed, full of ranchers, miners, and outlaws. Life there was harsh, marked by ethnic tensions, land disputes, and violent rivalries between powerful factions. Henry's mother, Catherine McCarty, remarried, taking the name Catherine Antrim, and Henry began calling himself Henry Antrim. But his mother died of tuberculosis when he was a young teenager, leaving him effectively an orphan. Alone and without a steady home, Henry survived through odd jobs in saloons, ranches, and stables, but also through petty theft and troublemaking. His first documented brush with the law came after he stole food, then later clothing from a laundry. The sheriff locked him in jail in a small cell. But even as a teenager, he showed a quick mind and restless spirit. He escaped custody by slipping up the chimney of the jail and fleeing into the night, the first recorded jailbreak in the story that would make him famous. From then on, he lived on the run. He drifted through the Southwest, sometimes using the name William Bonney. He found work as a cowboy, but also as a gambler and occasional thief. Violence was never far away. He joined with groups of young men who rustled cattle and stole horses, highly valuable property on the frontier. The region he roamed was caught in conflict known as the Lincoln County War, a vicious feud in southeastern New Mexico between rival business factions. One side was backed by established merchants and the local sheriff, while the other side was aligned with newer ranchers and businessmen trying to break the monopoly. Billy the Kid joined the side known as the Regulators, a group of armed men determined to avenge the murder of rancher John Tunstall, who had been shot under suspicious circumstances. Billy swore loyalty to Tunstall's memory. As a regulator, he fought in open gun battles, ambushes, and assassinations, cementing his reputation as a dangerous gunman. He became notorious for his quick draw, deadly aim, and fearless manner. Tales spread about him killing multiple men in face-to-face fights, though the exact count has always been debated and mythologized. Lawmen and newspapers portrayed him as a cold-blooded killer, while some local supporters saw him as a sort of avenger against corruption. As the Lincoln County War died down in violence and betrayals, Billy remained a wanted man. The territorial government offered rewards for his capture, and sheriffs across New Mexico hunted him. But he continued to elude them, living among friends and sympathizers, slipping over the border into Mexico, and using his knowledge of the terrain to stay one step ahead. His most famous and dramatic capture came at the hands of Pat Garrett, a former friend who had been elected sheriff specifically to bring Billy in. Garrett tracked him down to a remote farmhouse. Billy was surrounded and forced to surrender without a fight. He was taken to Mesilla for trial, convicted of murdering Sheriff William Brady during the Lincoln County War, and sentenced to hang. He was transferred to Lincoln, New Mexico to await execution. There, he was confined in the old courthouse building under tight guard. But Billy the Kid was not resigned to die quietly. He carefully watched his guards, planned his opportunity, and waited for the perfect moment. One afternoon, when only 2 deputies were on duty, he asked to use the outhouse outside under guard. Once back inside, he managed to slip his handcuffs. Some said he had filed them secretly, or used wire he'd hidden on himself. He attacked Deputy James Bell as Bell escorted him back upstairs, wrestling free and shooting him with Bell's own pistol on the courthouse staircase. He then ran to the sheriff's office in the building, where the other guard, Bob Ollinger, had left his shotgun leaning against the wall while he went to supervise other prisoners. Billy seized the shotgun, loaded and ready, and waited at the window. When Ollinger returned, hearing the commotion, Billy called out to him with a taunt. As Ollinger looked up, Billy fired both barrels, killing him instantly. With both guards dead, Billy moved quickly. He shattered the leg irons that remained on him using a pickaxe, scavenged weapons and ammunition from the office, and took a horse from outside. Before leaving, he reportedly called to bystanders that he didn't mean harm to them and rode off calmly, unhurried, vanishing into the landscape. This escape shocked the territory and made headlines across the West. It wasn't just that he had killed his guards. It was the daring, theatrical style of it, the boldness of walking right out of what was supposed to be a death sentence. It added to his legend, cementing him in popular imagination as the ultimate outlaw trickster. After escaping Lincoln, Billy returned to familiar haunts, protected by loyal friends and sympathizers. But he was now the most wanted man in the territory, with a price on his head that ensured no rest. Pat Garrett resumed the hunt, using informants to track Billy's movements. Billy's final days were marked by constant movement and hiding. He was spotted around Fort Sumner, where he had friends and possibly even a romantic interest. Garrett, determined to end the chase, laid a trap there. One night he waited in a darkened room of Pete Maxwell's house. Billy entered unexpectedly, possibly recognizing Garrett too late. Garrett fired, killing him instantly. Billy the Kid was buried the next day in Fort Sumner. He was only in his early 20s, but his legend was already secure. Newspapers had made him a symbol of frontier violence, romanticized outlaw freedom, and resistance to authority. Over the years, stories of Billy the Kid grew even wilder. Songs, books, and films turned him into an American icon. The young, doomed outlaw who escaped every trap until the final bullet. But behind the myth was a real young man shaped by poverty, loss, and the brutal ethics of frontier justice. He was an orphan who turned to crime, a participant in a bloody feud, a fugitive who lived by his wits and his gun. And most memorably, he was a prisoner who refused to accept the noose. His courthouse jailbreak, executed with deadly precision and raw nerve, remains one of the most famous escapes in the history of the American West, the act that guaranteed his immortality as Billy the Kid. Next, we have John Dillinger, the man who escaped with a wood carving. John Dillinger was born in 1903 in Indiana, the son of a grocer. He grew up in Indianapolis and later in the small town of Mooresville, after his father moved the family to what he hoped would be a calmer, safer place. But the move didn't tame John's restless nature. From a young age, he was known for being tough, impulsive, and wild, prone to petty trouble. His mother died when he was still a boy, and though his father remarried, the family remained strict and religious, something John often pushed against. As a teenager, he ran with local boys who drank, gambled, and sometimes stole. He dropped out of school and got work in factories but couldn't stand the grind or the low wages. Seeking structure or perhaps escape, he enlisted in the Navy but quickly deserted. He returned to Indiana, drifting through low-paid work but couldn't keep out of trouble. He married a local woman, hoping to settle, but the marriage quickly soured under the pressure of poverty and his legal problems. His criminal career really began with what should have been a minor robbery. He and an accomplice tried to hold up a local grocer. It was a poorly planned crime. Dillinger was caught and, wanting to avoid a harsh sentence, pleaded guilty in court, expecting leniency. Instead, the judge gave him a severe sentence, making an example of him. Sent to the Indiana State Prison, Dillinger entered as a young, small-time offender, but emerged hardened. He spent years among career criminals, bank robbers, and gang leaders. There he listened, learned, and formed alliances that would shape the rest of his life. Prison became his education in crime. When he was finally released, he wasted no time putting those lessons into action. He began robbing banks almost immediately. His approach was careful, often involving weeks of planning, inside information, and coordination with other ex-cons he'd met in prison. Dillinger became known for his charm and politeness during robberies. He sometimes vaulted bank counters with athletic ease, smiling and joking with tellers while seizing the money. Law enforcement quickly marked him as a dangerous criminal. He was arrested again in Ohio, sent to the Lima jail and locked up. But this time, he had friends on the outside. Members of his gang, recently freed from Indiana State Prison, in a breakout he had financed with smuggled weapons, returned the favour. They arrived at the Lima jail posing as lawmen, demanded Dillinger's release, and shot the sheriff dead when he resisted. Dillinger was free again, and his reputation exploded. With his gang, he launched a string of high-profile bank robberies across the Midwest. He became a media sensation. Newspapers splashed his face on front pages. Americans reeling from the Great Depression were fascinated. Some even cheered the daring bank robber who seemed to thumb his nose at the hated banks and the authorities. But his growing fame also brought relentless pursuit. He was eventually cornered in Tucson, Arizona. After a fire broke out at his hotel, local police recognized him while helping evacuate guests and arrested him without a fight. Indiana authorities were determined to prove they could hold him. They transported him to Crown Point, Indiana, which boasted of having an escape-proof jail. There he awaited trial for murder, guarded by heavily armed deputies and the county sheriff herself, a woman who courted publicity by posing for photos with Dillinger. But Dillinger's escape from Crown Point would become legend. He carefully studied the jail, its routines, and the guards. Using what he later claimed was a fake gun carved from wood and blackened with shoe polish, he tricked his jailers. Brandishing it convincingly, he bluffed the guards into opening his cell and disarming themselves. He then locked them up instead, rounded up other staff at gunpoint and took keys and weapons. Outside, he boldly commandeered the sheriff's own car, a Ford V8, and roared off with deputies locked behind him. The escape humiliated local law enforcement, made national headlines, and transformed him from notorious robber into a folk anti-hero. But the Crown Point escape had consequences beyond the publicity. By crossing state lines in a stolen vehicle, Dillinger violated a new federal crime statute, bringing the FBI fully into the case. J. Edgar Hoover, eager to prove his bureau's worth, made Dillinger America's first public enemy #1. Dillinger's life became a relentless chase. He moved constantly, changed hideouts, and had plastic surgery in Chicago in a desperate attempt to change his appearance. He wore out alliances, switched between gangs, and committed more robberies to fund his flight. The FBI and local police hunted him with increasing intensity. He was wounded in shootouts, lost close friends, and became more isolated and paranoid. Though he was helped by lovers and friends, his circle of safe places shrank. In his final months he hid in Chicago, staying with his girlfriend Polly Hamilton, and socializing with Anna Sage, a Romanian immigrant and brothel madam who faced deportation. Under pressure, Anna agreed to betray him to the FBI in exchange for leniency. She arranged to accompany Dillinger to a movie theatre, making it easy for agents to identify him. On the agreed night, Dillinger, Anna Sage in her distinctive orange dress, and Polly Hamilton went to the Biograph Theatre to watch a gangster film. FBI agents and Chicago police staked out the entrance. As Dillinger emerged, agents called his name. He attempted to flee, reaching for a pistol, but was shot multiple times and killed on the sidewalk. His death was as sensational as his life. Crowds gathered at the morgue. Souvenir hunters dipped handkerchiefs in his blood. Newspapers ran lurid headlines, cementing the image of Dillinger as the charismatic outlaw brought down by lawmen at last. Yet behind the legend was a real man, a restless, intelligent, sometimes charming but undeniably violent criminal. He planned his robberies with care, escaped jails with daring, and fought the law until his final breath. His escapes, especially from Crown Point, remain some of the most dramatic jailbreaks in American history. They weren't just acts of survival, but performances that humiliated authorities and captivated a Depression-era public hungry for both heroes and villains. John Dillinger's life stands as a vivid portrait of America's gangster era, a man shaped by poverty, war and prison, who became both feared criminal and folk legend, always moving, always defying the walls meant to hold him. Next, we have the Civil War commander who escaped imprisonment, John Morgan. John Hunt Morgan was born in Kentucky, part of a large, respected family with deep roots in the American South. His upbringing was marked by privilege, but also by a culture steeped in honor, family loyalty, and a code of personal bravery. The Morgans were well known locally for their land, wealth, and connections, ensuring John grew up surrounded by the expectations of leadership. As a boy, Morgan received a decent education for the time, though he was not always a diligent student. He showed more interest in physical pursuits than in scholarly ones. He was known for being bold, restless, and prone to testing limits. His youth was filled with riding horses, hunting, and developing the kind of rugged independence that would define him. When he reached adulthood, Morgan tried his hand at commerce, working in his family's businesses. He managed land, engaged in farming, and dabbled in local industry. But these pursuits failed to satisfy his restless spirit. He was drawn instead to the world of cavalry, tactics, and the martial virtues celebrated by the Southern gentry. He gained his first military experience during the Mexican-American War, where he served as a cavalryman. This service exposed him to real combat and gave him a taste for the romantic image of the mounted raider. Though he did not rise to great prominence in that conflict, it taught him the basics of command, scouting, and the importance of mobility. Returning home, Morgan resumed civilian life, marrying and managing his business affairs, but always with the bearing of a military man. He was a fixture of Kentucky society, known for his charm, tall and imposing figure, and personal generosity. Yet he also developed a reputation for being hot-tempered and fiercely proud. When the United States fractured and civil war broke out, Morgan's loyalty was clear. Though Kentucky was officially neutral at first and later stayed in the Union, Morgan joined the Confederacy, convinced his duty lay with the Southern cause. He raised a cavalry company at his own expense, gathering men who shared his loyalty and willingness to fight. Early in the war, Morgan made a name for himself with bold raids against Union supply lines and garrisons. He operated primarily in Kentucky and Tennessee, regions of mixed loyalties, where guerrilla tactics could be decisive. His raids disrupted Union communications and terrified supply depots, forcing the North to devote resources to guard against him. Morgan's command grew in size and fame. He built a cavalry regiment known for its speed, striking power, and audacious maneuvers. His men idolized him for his fearlessness and willingness to share hardships with them. He became known for his personal bravery, often leading charges himself. One of Morgan's defining qualities as a commander was his mastery of irregular tactics. He preferred to move fast, surprise the enemy, and vanish before a counterattack could be organized. His raids tied up Union forces far out of proportion to his numbers, but Morgan's most famous and controversial operation was his long raid into the north. Leading his cavalry across the Ohio River, he pushed deep into Indiana and Ohio, becoming the first Confederate general to conduct an extended invasion of Union states in that region. This raid was part military operation, part psychological warfare, aiming to spread panic and draw Union troops away from Southern fronts. His men cut telegraph lines, burned bridges, captured supplies, and spread alarm across towns unused to seeing Confederate soldiers. Newspapers followed his every move breathlessly. Yet as he pressed deeper north, the Union response tightened. Local militias, regular troops, and federal forces closed in, blocking his routes back to the south. Morgan tried to escape encirclement by splitting his forces and changing directions repeatedly, but eventually his command was worn down. Many of his men were captured or scattered. Morgan himself was cornered and surrendered with the last of his command in Ohio. He and his officers were taken to Ohio State Penitentiary, a high-security prison in Columbus. There he faced conditions meant to break the spirit of Confederate raiders. But Morgan's time in prison became the centerpiece of his legend. He refused to accept confinement passively. Along with a small band of loyal officers, he planned a dramatic escape. For months they worked carefully, digging a tunnel from their cells to outside the prison walls. They used smuggled tools and improvised implements, removing dirt discreetly and hiding signs of their work from guards. The escape was a feat of patience and coordination. When the tunnel was ready, Morgan led his men through it under cover of darkness. Emerging outside the prison walls, they slipped away into the city. He evaded search parties, managed to travel undetected for days, and eventually made his way south to friendly territory, greeted as a hero in Confederate lines. This escape cemented his image as the consummate raider, cunning, unbreakable, always ready to defy Union authority. Newspapers in the South celebrated his return, while Northern papers raged at the failure of their prison system. Back in Confederate service, Morgan resumed raiding, though by this stage of the war the South's fortunes were declining. His later raids were less successful, often hampered by dwindling resources and better Union coordination. He struggled with Confederate authorities over strategy, facing criticism for acting too independently or taking unnecessary risks. His final campaign took him back to East Tennessee. There, his forces engaged in further raids, trying to disrupt Union control. But Union cavalry and local Unionist forces were determined to catch him. During one of these operations, Morgan was surprised by Union troops while in Greenville. Accounts describe him being warned too late, attempting to flee, and being shot and killed in a backyard or garden while trying to escape. His death ended the career of one of the Confederacy's most famous cavalry raiders. Morgan was buried with honors by his men. In the South, he became a celebrated figure, the thunderbolt of the Confederacy, remembered for daring raids, charismatic leadership, and the audacity of his prison escape. Stories of his exploits were told and retold for decades, shaping the myth of the Southern cavalry hero who lived by speed, courage, and bold defiance. Yet behind the legend was a man of contradictions, a wealthy planter who championed a rebellion to defend a slave society, a master tactician whose raids inspired but also cost his men dearly, and an officer whose personal charisma won loyalty, even as his command sometimes skirted the edges of discipline. John Hunt Morgan's life was shaped by the violence and upheaval of civil war, marked by dramatic victories, humiliating defeats, and a prison break that remains one of the most celebrated escapes of the era. His story is inseparable from the broader tragedy of a divided nation, a tale of boldness, skill, and unyielding loyalty to a lost cause. Next, we have the man of the mountains, Giuseppe Musolino. Giuseppe Musolino was born in 1876 in Calabria, the far south of Italy, a region marked by stark poverty, rugged mountains, and ancient traditions. He grew up in a small village in the Aspromonte area, a place where life was harsh, work was backbreaking, and justice was often harshly dispensed or denied altogether. Musolino's family was poor but typical of the rural peasantry in Calabria. He worked from a young age as a charcoal burner, one of the most grueling and low-paying trades available, which required weeks spent deep in the forests tending smouldering mounds of wood and living rough. This life gave him physical toughness, deep knowledge of the mountains, and the ability to move quietly through rugged terrain. skills that would later prove essential. Southern Italy at that time was notorious for its lawlessness, and the state's justice system was deeply distrusted by the poor. Banditry was a known tradition, not simply crime, but often seen locally as a kind of rebellion against corrupt landlords, greedy tax collectors, and indifferent officials. Outlaws could become folk heroes, especially if they were believed to have been wronged. Musolino's trouble began with a crime that would change his life forever. He was accused of attempting to murder a fellow villager, Giovanni Antonio Malito, during a brawl in the village. Musolino always claimed he was innocent and that he had been framed. The local justice system was notoriously corrupt and biased against the poor. Witnesses were bribed or intimidated, and the trial was widely viewed as a sham. He was found guilty and sentenced to long years of harsh imprisonment. At the time, Italian prisons were grim, unsanitary and violent places, especially for someone of Musolino's low social standing. But Giuseppe refused to accept this fate. He planned his escape meticulously. While being transported by guards through the difficult Calabrian terrain, he waited for the perfect moment. Exploiting his knowledge of the mountains, he broke free from custody. Accounts differ on whether he attacked his guards or simply fled during a moment of distraction, and vanished into the wilderness. Once free, Musolino became an outlaw for real. But instead of fleeing the region entirely, he chose to stay in Calabria, living in the forests and crags he knew so well. He quickly became famous, and feared, as a master of evasion. The Italian authorities launched massive manhunts, deploying soldiers, police, and local informers, but they struggled to catch him. Musolino moved swiftly through mountain passes, hid in caves, and relied on networks of local supporters who fed him, warned him of patrols, and sometimes helped him escape tight traps. He built a reputation for being nearly impossible to capture. Stories spread that he could walk for miles barefoot in silence, cross rivers without leaving tracks, and vanish into the fog. To many poor Calabrians, he was a symbol of resistance against a legal system seen as corrupt and cruel. They called him the Brigand of the Aspromonte, blending fear and admiration in equal measure. But Musolino's life on the run was violent. He took revenge on those he claimed had betrayed him at trial. He ambushed and killed men who had testified against him, making clear that he considered himself wronged and was delivering his own form of justice. He sent letters to local newspapers and officials, proclaiming his innocence of the original crime, but admitting to these killings as justified retribution. His defiance captured the public's imagination far beyond Calabria. Newspapers across Italy followed his movements breathlessly. Some editorials condemned him as a murderer and a savage. Others portrayed him as a tragic figure, a victim of injustice turned avenger. For years he roamed the mountains, slipping past patrols, surviving attempts to capture or kill him. There were dramatic confrontations, including gunfights with police and soldiers sent to hunt him down. In these encounters he was wounded more than once, but always managed to escape. Authorities eventually resorted to ever larger search parties, offering big rewards for his capture. The government wanted to end the embarrassment of a single outlaw defying their forces so publicly. But Musolino's knowledge of the local terrain and support from some villagers gave him the upper hand again and again. Eventually, however, the net closed. He was betrayed. Some accounts suggest a local informant revealed his hideout. He was captured alive after a confrontation that left him wounded. Musolino's trial became a sensation. Crowds packed the courtroom to see the famous bandit in chains. He remained defiant throughout, proclaiming his innocence of the original attempted murder and defending his revenge as justice against false witnesses. He was articulate, forceful, and unrepentant, refusing to beg for mercy. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. The state wanted to make an example of him, showing that the rule of law could not be mocked by a single man, no matter how clever or popular. Musolino was sent to a prison far from his native Calabria. His health declined behind bars. The harsh conditions of Italian prisons, compounded by his old wounds and years of living rough, took their toll. He died in custody, never seeing freedom again. Yet his legend lived on. In Calabria and other parts of Italy, people continued to debate whether he was a ruthless murderer or a wronged man who became an outlaw only because the state offered no justice. Ballads and stories were told about his escapes, his long years evading capture, and the cunning tricks he used to outwit the police. Giuseppe Musolino remains one of Italy's most famous bandits, a figure who embodied both the violence and the bitter injustices of his time. His life tells of a man who refused to submit to what he saw as corrupt authority, who escaped prison to wage his own war of vengeance, and who became a symbol of both fear and admiration in the rugged mountains he called home. Next, we have the infamous Ronnie Biggs, the man a part of the great train robbery in 1963 that got away with what would now be equivalent to $95 million. But there is much more to the story than that. Ronnie Biggs was born in London into a working-class family. He grew up during a period marked by economic hardship, lingering after effects of the Great Depression and the turmoil of the Second World War. His childhood was typical of many boys in his neighbourhood, tough, streetwise, and marked by early brushes with trouble. As a teenager, Biggs displayed the signs of a restless, rebellious nature. He got involved in petty crime, theft, burglary, and small-time scams that brought him repeatedly into contact with the police. These early offences earned him a reputation as a habitual offender long before he was an adult. He was sent to a borstal, a type of youth detention centre, intended to reform young criminals through strict discipline and labour. But if anything, it hardened him further. He learned criminal skills, made contacts among other offenders, and grew more determined to live outside the law. After leaving the borstal system, Biggs drifted in and out of crime, taking on occasional work but never settling into a legitimate trade. He served in the army for a short time, but this too ended badly. He went absent without leave, eventually being discharged. Back in civilian life, he married a young woman named Charmian Powell, and for a brief period, he seemed ready to settle down. They had children together, and he tried sporadically to work in the building trades. But the allure of easy money and the companionship of London's criminal underworld proved too strong. Biggs fell in with more experienced thieves, including figures from the South London gang scene. He was a minor player compared to some of the hardened professionals he admired, but he was dependable, unafraid of risk, and eager for big scores. This willingness led him into the orbit of Bruce Reynolds, a charismatic career criminal with a talent for planning large-scale robberies. Reynolds was organising what would become one of the most famous heists in British history, the Great Train Robbery. The target was a Royal Mail train travelling from Glasgow to London loaded with cash. The plan was intricate, involving stopping the train in a remote area, subduing the crew, and making off with millions of pounds in used banknotes. Biggs was brought in not as a mastermind, but because he had a useful contact, a retired train driver who could help operate the locomotive after the crew was subdued. On the night of the robbery, the gang successfully stopped the train at a block signal, overpowered the staff, and transferred the money to their vehicles. They retreated to a nearby farm to divide it up and lay low. The haul was enormous, over 2.5 million British pounds, an astronomical sum at the time, ensuring immediate infamy. Despite careful planning, the gang left evidence behind at the farm hideout. Police found fingerprints, abandoned equipment, and other clues. Arrests followed in waves. Biggs fled with his share but was eventually captured by Scotland Yard. He stood trial with other gang members and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence meant to show that the British state would not tolerate such high-profile crime. He was sent to HMP Wandsworth in London, one of the country's most secure prisons. But Biggs was not prepared to serve decades behind bars. Along with other inmates, he plotted an escape. The plan was daring. During exercise in the prison yard, Biggs and his accomplices scaled the high wall with the help of a rope ladder thrown from the outside. A waiting vehicle sped them away before the guards could respond effectively. Once free, Biggs began a new phase of life on the run. He altered his appearance with minor plastic surgery, changed his name, and used fake documents to travel. He fled first to France, where he was reunited with his family, then on to Australia, hoping to lose himself in the vast distances of a new continent. In Australia, he lived for several years under assumed identities, working as a carpenter and trying to blend in. But British detectives continued to pursue leads, and the risk of extradition loomed. Learning that Scotland Yard was closing in, Biggs made another move, this time to Brazil. Brazil proved far more accommodating. He entered on false documents but soon established a new life in Rio de Janeiro. He fathered a child with a Brazilian woman, a move that would later prove vital. Under Brazilian law at the time, a parent of a Brazilian child could not be extradited for non-violent crimes. For years, Biggs lived openly in Rio, even as his notoriety grew. He became something of a minor celebrity, especially among tourists and journalists fascinated by his audacious escape. He was known to invite visiting Brits for drinks, posing for photos with them, and even selling T-shirts and memorabilia celebrating his criminal past. The British government tried repeatedly to have him extradited. Scotland Yard detectives travelled to Brazil, interviewed him, and worked with local authorities, but Biggs's legal position was secure. His child was his protection. He taunted the British press and authorities, cultivating his image as the unrepentant rogue. Meanwhile, his personal life was less glamorous. He faced financial struggles, health issues, and the strain of living as an international fugitive. His marriage to Charmian collapsed under the weight of his criminal life and constant evasion. As the years passed, Biggs aged in the hot sun of Rio, watching as other great train robbers served long sentences or were released back in Britain. He lived in a modest apartment, living off royalties from media deals and his carefully maintained legend. Eventually his health began to fail seriously. Suffering from strokes and other ailments, he made the surprising decision to return voluntarily to England. Some said he wanted to die on British soil. Others speculated he simply could no longer afford medical care in Brazil. When he arrived in the UK, he was immediately arrested. Despite his age and infirmity, he was sent back to prison to finish his sentence. His return drew enormous media attention, with journalists camped outside the prison and public debate over whether such an old, frail man should remain incarcerated. After serving several years in poor health, Biggs was released on compassionate grounds. He spent his final years in a nursing home, unable to speak clearly after multiple strokes, but still drawing the fascination of the public. He died an old man, no longer the slim, grinning fugitive who had once mocked the law from a beach in Rio. Yet his legend survived. To some, Ronnie Biggs was a folk anti-hero, a working-class Londoner who outwitted the system, escaped prison in broad daylight, and mocked British justice from a tropical paradise. To others, he was a criminal who glorified theft, mocked his victims, and profited from crime long after the fact. What is undeniable is that his escape from Wandsworth Prison and flight to Brazil became one of the most famous prison breaks in modern British history. His life story blended crime, adventure, notoriety, and a flair for self-promotion that ensured his place in popular memory. Ronnie Biggs lived and died as one of the world's most famous fugitives, a man whose whole life seemed dedicated to proving that walls and bars were never enough to hold him. Next, we have, I'd say, the most all-around clever man on this list. which is not an easy title to have. His name, Willie Sutton. Willie Sutton was born in 1901 in Brooklyn, New York, into a working-class Irish-American family. His upbringing was marked by poverty and struggle, typical of many immigrant families in the crowded boroughs of New York City at the time. As a boy, he was known for being clever, quick with words, and observant, qualities that would serve him in ways both good and bad. Though small in stature, he had a wiry toughness. He left school early, barely making it to his teens before he was working odd jobs to help support the family. But honest labour paid little, and Willie quickly discovered a talent for crime. He started with petty theft, picking pockets, and burglarizing shops at night, honing his skills in the crowded streets and alleys of Brooklyn. He was smart, careful, and imaginative. Unlike many thugs who relied on brute force, Sutton was known for planning his crimes meticulously. He also developed a talent for disguise. Early on, he realized that a well-dressed man could walk into places unnoticed. He perfected the art of posing as a delivery man, a repairman, or even a bank guard to gain access to vaults and offices. As he graduated to bank robbery, Sutton became a master at casing targets. He would study bank routines, watch employees, and learn security schedules in detail before striking. His jobs were marked by precision, speed, and an uncanny ability to make himself seem invisible until it was too late. Willie Sutton was also known for avoiding unnecessary violence. He carried guns but preferred not to use them. He claimed he never killed anyone during his long criminal career, and this fed into his later reputation as a kind of gentleman thief. But despite his careful planning, the law eventually caught up with him. He was arrested multiple times, tried and sent to prison. Yet this was another area where Sutton's reputation grew. He became nearly as famous for escaping custody as he was for robbing banks. One of his early escapes came when he and 2 accomplices broke out of the Philadelphia County Prison. They sawed through cell bars and used a makeshift ladder to scale the walls. The escape required patience, timing, and steady nerves, all qualities Sutton had in abundance. Once outside, he simply blended into the city's crowds and vanished. Arrested again later, he was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, one of the most secure prisons in the country, designed with thick stone walls and modern surveillance for the time. But Sutton refused to stay confined. Along with other inmates, he spent months planning an elaborate tunnel beneath the prison walls. They worked in secrecy, removing dirt in small amounts to avoid detection. When the tunnel was complete, Sutton and his fellow prisoners crawled through it to freedom. The breakout became one of the most famous in the prison's history. While many of the escapees were quickly recaptured, Sutton managed to evade the dragnet for a time, moving across state lines and resuming his old trade. His robberies continued, often marked by clever disguises and brazen confidence. He wore delivery uniforms, maintenance clothes, and even posed as a police officer to gain access. One of his trademarks was entering a bank during daylight hours, chatting calmly with employees or guards, then pulling a gun only at the crucial moment to demand cash. When authorities finally caught him again, he was sentenced to long years in prison, this time at Attica Correctional Facility in New York. But Sutton's restless mind never stopped working on the problem of escape. He studied routines, observed guards, and looked for weaknesses. In Attica, he executed another spectacular break. Disguised in a prison guard's uniform, he walked calmly with other guards to the prison's outer gate. His confident bearing fooled the gatekeepers, who let him through. By the time anyone realized what had happened, he was gone. His escapes embarrassed prison officials and delighted the public. Newspapers wrote stories with headlines that alternated between outrage and admiration. Sutton himself fueled his legend with his wit and charm. When asked why he robbed banks, he famously said, "Because that's where the money is," a line that became part of American criminal folklore. For decades, Sutton was one of the FBI's most wanted men. He was pursued across multiple states, using aliases, forged documents, and changing his appearance to stay ahead of the law. But the constant running wore him down. He relied on a network of underworld contacts but could never stay in one place too long. Eventually his luck ran out again. He was arrested in Brooklyn after a tip from the public. By then he was older, showing the strain of a life spent in hiding and prison breaks. He was sent back to prison yet again, facing multiple long sentences for robbery and escape. But even as an inmate, Sutton was a celebrity. Reporters came to interview him. He wrote about his life and methods, offering advice on how banks could improve their security. His writings revealed a sharp mind that enjoyed puzzles and took pride in outwitting systems designed to confine him. As he aged and his health declined, public sympathy for Sutton grew. Many saw him less as a dangerous criminal and more as a relic of a bygone era of crime, a bank robber whose heists seemed almost quaint compared to modern violence. He was eventually released on parole on humanitarian grounds. He spent his final years living quietly in New York, frail but still sharp. He gave interviews, shared stories, and watched as his legend grew. He died with a reputation as one of America's most famous and cleverest bank robbers, a man who escaped prisons with daring plans, robbed banks with careful disguises, and left behind a legacy of audacity and ingenuity. Willie Sutton's life remains a classic American outlaw story. He was no Robin Hood. He robbed for himself, but he did it with style, planning, and an unshakable confidence that he could outsmart any lock, wall, or guard. His escapes weren't just acts of desperation, but carefully engineered feats that proved, in his own way, that prison walls were never as strong as the human mind determined to defeat them. Next, we have the amazing story of the Turkish foreigner Billy Hayes. Billy Hayes was born in the United States, growing up in a typical middle-class American family. He was raised in New York with a suburban upbringing that provided the comforts and opportunities common to many of his generation. He was intelligent and independent-minded, known for his curiosity about the world beyond his immediate surroundings. As a young man, he attended college but found himself restless, drawn to adventure and the promise of travel. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of enormous cultural change in America, with youth challenging traditional norms and exploring new ideas. Hayes was no exception. He became part of the counterculture movement, interested in music, literature, and experimentation. Part of that experimentation involved drugs. Billy wasn't a violent criminal. Instead, he was a recreational user who turned to smuggling as a way to finance his travels. At the time, drug smuggling was a temptation for many young Westerners exploring Europe and the Middle East, lured by the promise of easy money and a sense of rebellion. Billy Hayes made the fateful decision to smuggle hashish out of Turkey. On previous trips, he had managed to do so successfully, carrying small quantities strapped to his body and flying out of Istanbul without incident. Emboldened by these successes, he returned again, convinced he could keep beating the system. But on his last attempt, Turkish authorities were prepared. He was arrested at the Istanbul airport with packages of hashish taped to his body. The arrest was immediate and public. Turkish police treated the case as a serious crime. The political climate in Turkey at that time was growing harsher, with the government cracking down on drug trafficking to send a message to its own citizens and to foreign governments. Hayes was taken into custody and subjected to interrogation, though he later described being treated with relative restraint compared to the horror stories told about other prisoners. He was tried in a Turkish court and initially sentenced to a few years in prison, a punishment already severe by American standards for a non-violent smuggling offence. But during his incarceration, the Turkish government, under pressure to look tough on drugs, changed its policy. Near the end of his sentence, his term was suddenly extended to 30 years. effectively condemning him to spend the prime of his life in Turkish prisons. Billy Hayes was imprisoned primarily in Sarmalçılar prison in Istanbul. Conditions were harsh. The facility was overcrowded, unsanitary, and violent. He described the prison population as a dangerous mix of petty thieves, hardened criminals, and the mentally ill, all crammed together with little oversight. Guards could be brutal or indifferent, and discipline was often enforced through fear and informant networks. Hayes survived by learning the culture of the prison. He picked up Turkish, navigated local customs, and built alliances. He described making friends and enemies among prisoners and guards alike. He also witnessed savage beatings and mental breakdowns among inmates. For a time he tried to adapt, even meditating and reading extensively to hold on to sanity. But as his sentence was suddenly increased to 30 years, any hope of waiting out his punishment collapsed. He began planning an escape. He watched routines carefully, considered bribing guards, and sought any weakness in the system he could exploit. He made at least one failed attempt, sneaking away in civilian clothes during a prison work detail, only to be caught shortly afterward. He was beaten and transferred to a harsher facility on Imrala Island, a place reserved for the most dangerous or politically problematic prisoners, surrounded by water and guarded carefully. Despite these obstacles, Hayes refused to give up. His final escape was as daring as it was desperate. According to his own account, he waited for a moment when the guards were distracted and overpowered one of them. He tied the man up, stole civilian clothes, and fled the prison. He then stole a small rowboat and launched himself into the Marmara Sea, rowing for hours toward the mainland in darkness. Reaching the opposite shore, he was still in danger. He travelled overland, avoiding police and checkpoints, moving cautiously through rural Turkey and across the border into Greece. Once on Greek soil, he sought help from authorities who, sympathetic to his plight and hostile to Turkey at the time, helped him get back to the United States. Billy Hayes's return to America was a sensation. He was a young American who had survived years in foreign prisons and escaped in a real-life adventure that felt like fiction. He gave interviews describing the harshness of Turkish justice and the brutal conditions of its prisons. His story became even more famous with the publication of his memoir Midnight Express, written with William Hoffer. The book provided a first-person account of his arrest, imprisonment and escape, emphasizing the cruelty of the Turkish prison system and his desperate longing for freedom. The memoir was adapted into a Hollywood film directed by Alan Parker and written by Oliver Stone. The movie was a critical and commercial success, winning Academy Awards and shocking audiences with its graphic depiction of Turkish prison brutality. Brad Davis played Hayes, portraying him as a broken man driven to violence by injustice. But the film also became highly controversial. Many criticized it for demonizing Turkish people, portraying them as uniformly cruel and barbaric. Hayes himself would later acknowledge that the movie exaggerated or distorted aspects of his story, creating a one-sided image that fueled anti-Turkish sentiment. In the years after his escape and fame, Billy Hayes tried to reconcile these contradictions. He travelled extensively, gave lectures, and even returned to Turkey decades later to make amends and talk about the need for understanding. He expressed regret that the film adaptation had harmed Turkey's reputation more than he intended, insisting his anger had been at the prison system rather than the entire nation. Hayes continued to write, act, and speak publicly about his experience. He used his notoriety to advocate against harsh prison sentences for non-violent drug offences, arguing that his own crime had been foolish, but did not deserve the punishment he received. He also promoted awareness of prisoners' rights and the psychological toll of incarceration. Though forever known for the hashish smuggling that landed him in prison, Billy Hayes remained best known as the man who refused to give up, who studied his guards, learned the language of his captors, survived brutal conditions, and escaped across the sea in a stolen rowboat. His life became a symbol of both reckless youthful arrogance and unbreakable will. For some, he was a cautionary tale about the risks of crime abroad. For others, he was an enduring example of the human drive for freedom no matter the odds. Billy Hayes' story endures because it is not just about crime and punishment, but about survival, resourcefulness, and the lengths to which someone will go to reclaim their life when it has been taken away. Next, we have the man who needs no introduction, Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera, better known to the world as El Chapo. El Chapo was born in rural Sinaloa, Mexico, a region long famous for its rugged mountains, poverty, and deep-rooted drug cultivation. He grew up in a poor farming family in a small village where opportunities were few and survival meant hard labor. His childhood was marked by struggle and violence. Stories tell of a boy who began working in the fields at an early age, planting poppies for opium production. His father was reportedly abusive, forcing him to toughen up quickly. With little formal schooling, Joaquin learned early that the only real power in his world belonged to those who controlled the drug trade. As a teenager, he began working for local marijuana and opium growers. Sinaloa had produced some of Mexico's earliest drug traffickers, and young Guzman quickly found his way into that underworld. He proved himself dependable, ruthless when needed, and very good at moving product through the remote, guarded trails of the mountains. Ambitious and cunning, he began as a driver and worker for older established traffickers, but soon moved up. He worked under Pedro Avilés and later with Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the powerful figure known as El Padrino who ran the Guadalajara cartel, Mexico's first true drug empire. Guzman learned everything he could about trafficking routes, smuggling logistics, bribing officials, and enforcing loyalty through fear. When the Guadalajara cartel splintered, Guzman and his allies founded what would become the Sinaloa cartel. He earned the nickname El Chapo, meaning shorty, for his stocky, short stature, but no one underestimated him. He specialized in organizing large-scale trafficking operations, particularly into the United States, using trucks, planes, ships, and later, elaborate tunnels under the border. El Chapo was known not just for violence, but for creative smuggling. He oversaw the construction of cross-border tunnels equipped with rails and lighting, a tactic that let his cartel move tons of cocaine and marijuana into the US undetected. He bribed police, judges, politicians, and military officers at all levels of Mexican government, ensuring protection for his operations. His rise brought him wealth beyond imagination, private zoos, fleets of luxury cars, safe houses across Mexico, and wads of cash he famously burned once to keep warm while on the run. But it also brought attention from Mexican and US authorities. Guzman's first major capture came after a period of bloody cartel warfare. Arrested by Mexican authorities, he was sent to Puente Grande, a high-security prison outside Guadalajara. But even behind bars, El Chapo remained in control. He bribed guards, continued to run cartel operations from his cell, and lived in comfort with privileges smuggled in for him. His first escape became legendary in Mexico. After bribing dozens of prison staff, he's said to have hidden in a laundry cart, wheeled calmly out of the gates while guards looked the other way. Other accounts suggest even less subtlety, simply paying enough money that the guards let him walk free. This escape humiliated the Mexican government, exposing the deep corruption in its penal system. Once free, El Chapo resumed cartel leadership, expanding his territory during a time of extraordinary violence. He waged war against rival cartels, especially the Tijuana cartel and the Juarez cartel, leaving thousands dead in gruesome battles for smuggling routes. Mass graves, decapitations, and bodies hanging from bridges became trademarks of cartel intimidation. But despite the violence, El Chapo also maintained a certain mystique. In parts of Sinaloa, he was seen as a folk hero. He was rumoured to give money to the poor, pay for local festivals, and offer protection to communities willing to support him. Narco ballads, corridos, were written in his honour, glorifying his daring escapes and kingpin lifestyle. Mexican and US authorities continued to hunt him, working through intelligence sharing, informants, and military operations. After years of evasion, he was captured again in a resort town by Mexican Marines. He was paraded before the press as a sign of the government's success. This time he was sent to Altiplano, Mexico's most secure prison, designed to hold even the most dangerous inmates. But El Chapo had no intention of staying put. His second major escape was even more elaborate and embarrassing for the government. From his cell in Altiplano, he entered a small shower stall, the only part of the cell not visible to guards on camera. Below the shower was the entrance to a tunnel dug with astonishing precision. The tunnel ran more than a mile underground, complete with lighting, ventilation, and even rails for a modified motorcycle, used to ferry tools and dirt. Cartel engineers had spent months, if not years, planning and digging from a safe house outside the prison walls, precisely locating his cell and emerging beneath it. When guards realized he was gone, they found the tunnel entrance in the floor, its walls reinforced and lined for easy passage. The sophistication of the escape stunned the world. It proved that Guzman still commanded vast resources and loyal soldiers willing to risk everything to free him. After escaping, El Chapo went into hiding but could not resist maintaining control over his empire. He moved frequently between safe houses, protected by rings of security and informants who warned him of raids. Mexican and US agencies stepped up their efforts, employing drones, wiretaps, and elite military units to hunt him down. Eventually, Mexican Marines tracked him to a house in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. The raid turned into a violent shootout. El Chapo fled through secret tunnels connected to the city's sewers, but he was eventually caught on a highway while trying to escape in a stolen car. This time, Mexico agreed to extradite him to the United States, recognizing that its prisons could no longer guarantee he would stay locked up. He was flown to New York and placed in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, one of the most secure federal jails in America. In the US, El Chapo faced a massive trial. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his role in running the Sinaloa cartel: drug shipments by the ton, money laundering on an industrial scale, bribery of officials across Mexico, and violent murders of rivals and traitors. Witnesses included former cartel members who described his personal orders for torture and killings. Despite his history of escapes, in the US he now faces no such opportunity. He is kept in near total isolation, with guards rotated frequently to prevent bribery. After a lengthy trial, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. He was sent to the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, designed to ensure that even the most dangerous criminals could not communicate or escape. This is where he still resides to this day. From that prison cell, Joaquin Guzman Loera's voice finally fell silent. But his legend lived on, as the man who built the world's most powerful drug empire, who bribed his way out of prisons, who'd escaped out of more tunnels than should have been possible, and who made himself a folk hero and a villain in equal measure. El Chapo's life is the story of poverty turned into power through ruthless violence, cunning business sense, and an unmatched talent for escape. It is also a story of how that power finally met its limits in the face of determined law enforcement, and a prison system designed to hold even the world's most slippery fugitive. Next, we have the man who found a new type of escape method, the Ariel escape. His name, Pascal Payet. Pascal Payet was born in 1963 in France. growing up in the tough, hard-scrabble suburbs where poverty, crime, and tight-knit social codes shaped many young men's paths. Little is documented in detail about his early childhood, but he came of age in the south of France, particularly around Marseille, a port city with a long history of organised crime, smuggling and violence. As a teenager and young man, Payet was drawn into crime early. He had the intelligence and nerve for it. He started with petty theft and local robberies, developing a reputation among associates for being audacious, self-assured and absolutely unafraid of risk. He also showed early signs of being a planner, not content with small-time hits, but constantly looking for bigger targets and more dramatic scores. Eventually he fell in with crews who specialised in high-stakes robberies. This was a world of armoured car heists, elaborate planning, and fierce loyalty within tight criminal teams. These operations required discipline and nerve. The south of France had its own traditions of these robberies, with gangs using military-grade weapons and carefully timed attacks. Payet became known in these circles as both reliable muscle and a smart strategist. He developed a particular style, precise, calculating, and always looking for the unexpected angle that would let him and his partners get away clean. But violent crime in France comes with a heavy police response. His most notorious crime before his prison escapes was an armoured car robbery in Salon de Provence. During this heist, shots were fired, and someone was killed, a killing that would help seal his fate in court later. Payet was arrested, tried and convicted, receiving a heavy sentence for armed robbery and murder. He was sent to prison, not just any facility, but high-security prisons in France known for strict routines, strong walls, and harsh discipline. But Payet was not the type to settle in for a life behind bars. From the start of his sentence, he set his mind on escape. He watched, learned, and planned. Prison authorities quickly came to see him as a high-risk inmate, someone who commanded respect among other prisoners and whose intelligence made him dangerous. But they underestimated just how far he would go. His first escape was not only successful but spectacular, and it would make him infamous. Payet didn't try to break out by force or stealth. Instead, he coordinated an escape by helicopter. Outside, accomplices hijacked a helicopter, forced its pilot to fly to the prison yard and landed inside the walls. Guards could do little. The arrival was so sudden, so audacious, that they were caught off guard. Payet climbed aboard and was lifted to freedom in front of stunned prison staff. This escape made headlines across France and Europe. It seemed like something from a Hollywood script, a daring cinematic act that humiliated the French prison system. After his escape, Payet went underground. He used safe houses, criminal contacts and careful planning to stay ahead of the manhunt. But law enforcement was determined. They knew he was too high profile to let go. Eventually he was recaptured and sent back to prison under even stricter security. He was moved to facilities designed to stop any repeat of his helicopter stunt. Authorities transferred him repeatedly, trying to keep him off balance and break his connections. But Payet did not stop plotting. Even while in prison, he used coded messages and criminal contacts to plan further helicopter operations, not just for himself, but for other inmates. In a notorious example, he coordinated another helicopter escape that freed 3 fellow inmates from prison in southern France. Again, accomplices hijacked a helicopter at gunpoint, forced the pilot to land in the prison yard and extracted the prisoners before flying away. This was even more embarrassing for the authorities because Payet himself was still in custody at the time. It showed that he was able to mastermind complex operations from behind bars, using smuggled phones, bribed intermediaries, and loyal friends willing to take huge risks. After his role in orchestrating these additional escapes was discovered, Payet's status was upgraded to France's highest security threat level. He was now viewed as not just a dangerous criminal, but an escape mastermind capable of humiliating the entire prison system. To stop him, Prison authorities adopted extreme measures. He was placed in solitary confinement for extended periods. He was moved constantly from one high-security prison to another in an effort to disrupt his networks. Guards were rotated and closely vetted to prevent bribery. His mail was monitored, his visitors strictly controlled, and any communication he attempted was scrutinized for coded escape plans. Despite this, Payet still managed another helicopter escape. In one of the most astonishing episodes of his criminal career, he once again had outside accomplices hijack a helicopter, fly it over the prison, and lift him out in a daring daylight raid. This escape underscored his reputation as the king of the helicopter escape. It wasn't just about brute force or violence, it was about planning, audacity, and a willingness to take risks others wouldn't even dream of. Each escape embarrassed French authorities, led to high-level investigations and forced prisons to overhaul their security procedures. But the law eventually caught up again. Payet was recaptured, and this time the state was determined there would be no more escapes. He was placed under near-permanent solitary confinement, in cells with reinforced ceilings and walls, limited movement, and constant surveillance. Prison administrators shared intelligence across facilities to ensure no one could repeat his helicopter extraction trick. Throughout his incarcerations, Payet became something of a folk anti-hero in France. Some saw him as a violent criminal who endangered lives, orchestrated robberies, and deserved no sympathy. Others viewed him as a symbol of defiance against a system he refused to let cage him. A modern outlaw whose prison breaks felt like acts of rebellion. Journalists wrote profiles of him. Law enforcement used his story to argue for stricter prison security, especially against helicopter escapes, a crime almost unheard of in France before Payet turned it into his signature move. In interviews and reports, he was described as disciplined, intelligent, and extremely determined. Even his enemies acknowledged he was no ordinary thug, but a man who spent endless hours planning every detail, who understood psychology, and who inspired loyalty among friends willing to risk prison time to help him fly away. As he aged in prison, the French state never relaxed its guard. He became an example for the entire penal system of what could happen if even a single inmate was underestimated. He remains one of the most famous prison escape artists in modern European history, with a record of successful helicopter escapes unmatched by anyone else. Pascal Payet's life is ultimately a story of crime, violence, and defiance. It is the story of a young man who chose armed robbery, who killed during a heist, and who refused to let prison contain him, no matter how high the walls, how thick the bars, or how watchful the guards. His helicopter escapes remain among the most dramatic jailbreaks ever recorded, a testament to planning, nerve, and the enduring human impulse to fly away from whatever cage holds us. Next, the man who inspired the movie I Love You, Philip Morris, starring Jim Carrey. The man who escaped multiple times in some of the most creative ways you will ever hear. Stephen J. Russell. Stephen J. Russell was born in the United States in 1957 and grew up in a fairly ordinary middle-class environment. He was raised in Virginia by adoptive parents who provided stability and traditional values. From the outside, he looked like a typical Southern boy, polite, clever, and well-mannered. But even as a child, Russell displayed a streak of mischief and a restless, inventive mind. He excelled in school in certain subjects but seemed bored by routine. Those who knew him remembered his easy charm and quick wit. As he got older, he learned to use that charm to talk his way into and out of trouble, developing the kind of polished social skills that would later serve him in astonishing ways. Russell's adult life began along relatively conventional lines. He married, settled down, and worked as a police officer for a time. But even then, he chafed at authority and rules. He also wrestled privately with his sexuality, living for years in the closet before deciding he could no longer live dishonestly about that part of himself. After leaving his wife, Russell moved to Florida. It was there that he began living openly as a gay man, embracing the freedom of a new life. He also met the man who would become the love of his life, Philip Morris, a gentle, kind-hearted man who would later be central to Russell's most famous crimes. But Stephen Russell's new life in Florida came at a cost. He developed expensive tastes, luxury cars, fine clothes, lavish dinners. To pay for it all, he turned to fraud. He had a brilliant mind for numbers, an excellent memory, and the charisma needed to win trust quickly. His scams began relatively small, forging checks, faking identities to open lines of credit. But he soon escalated to bigger cons. He impersonated corporate executives, used stolen identities, and even got a job as CFO at a company in Houston, where he promptly embezzled vast sums. He created fake invoices, diverted payments, and laundered the money with dizzying complexity. Inevitably, the law caught up. Russell was arrested and sentenced to prison in Texas. But prison would prove to be merely another stage for his ingenuity. His first famous escape was simple but audacious. While imprisoned, he faked a heart attack so convincingly that guards rushed him to an outside hospital. Once there, he impersonated an FBI agent on the phone, calling the hospital staff himself and instructing them to release his prisoner into custody. The staff, confused and intimidated by his confident, authoritative voice, let him go. Russell simply walked out the door in civilian clothes. He was free for a time but quickly resumed fraud to finance life on the run, making him a wanted man again. He was caught and sent back to prison. But Russell had no intention of staying. His second major escape was even more elaborate. He managed to obtain green markers in prison and used them to dye his standard white prison uniform, the same shade of green worn by Texas Department of Criminal Justice medical staff. Dressed as a doctor, he confidently walked past guards, clipboard in hand, giving curt nods and orders. No one questioned the uniform or his manner. He strolled right out of the prison gates. Captured again, he was returned to prison with even higher security. But even that didn't hold him. His third escape was the most dramatic. While in custody for previous frauds, Russell obtained medical forms and began forging them with stunning precision. He sent fake documents to prison administrators indicating that he had been diagnosed with HIV/AIDS and was in the final stages of the disease. He then starved himself and took laxatives to look emaciated. Prison doctors and staff, believing the paperwork and his appearance, petitioned for compassionate medical release. Russell was let out early to die at home, but instead of a hospice he went on the run again, healthier than he had been in years. Each time he escaped, Russell returned to fraud. He could not resist the game. He impersonated lawyers, judges, and corporate officers. At one point, he even posed as his own lawyer, calling the court to reduce his bail. Perhaps the most audacious of all was his fourth major escape attempt. After his HIV hoax had been discovered and he'd been rearrested, he used his phone privileges in jail to impersonate a judge, calling court clerks and dictating a reduction in his own bail amount from hundreds of thousands of dollars to just $45,000. When it went through, he paid it and walked out yet again. His motivation was always the same: to get back to Philip Morris, the man he loved. Russell repeatedly said that all of his escapes and frauds were aimed at reuniting with Morris and providing for him. Their relationship was both genuine and destructive, a love story twisted up with crime and deception. Eventually, Russell became one of America's most wanted fugitives, hunted by U.S. Marshals and Texas law enforcement. His face was known to wardens, guards, and police nationwide. When he was finally caught for the last time, he was sentenced to an extraordinary term in Texas, over 140 years in prison, primarily due to his repeated escapes and the scale of his fraud. Because of his ingenuity and success at beating the system, Texas classified him as an escape risk of the highest order. He has spent much of his time in solitary confinement or under intense observation. Even today, authorities remain wary of giving him any freedom at all, convinced he would exploit any weakness. Russell's story drew widespread public fascination. He became famous not for violence, but for intelligence, audacity, and an undeniable flair for deception. He never used weapons, never harmed anyone physically. Instead, he used words, charm, and forgery. A white-collar outlaw with the soul of a trickster. His life inspired the film I Love You, Philip Morris, starring Jim Carrey and Ewan McGregor. The film portrayed not just the wild escapes and cons, but also the genuine love story that drove much of Russell's behaviour. To many, Stephen J. Russell remains one of the most remarkable con artists and escape artists in modern criminal history, a man whose brain was his greatest weapon, who proved again and again that locks and bars alone cannot hold someone willing to think their way out. His story is not just one of crime, but of human ingenuity pushed to criminal extremes. It's the story of a man who refused to live by society's rules, who tricked the system over and over, and who paid for it with decades behind bars. Always watched, always feared for what he might think of next. Now we will drift all the way back to the 16th century to hear about John Gerard. John Gerard was born into an England torn by violent religious divisions. He grew up in a country that had officially become Protestant under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, where Catholicism was not just discouraged but actively persecuted. His family was Catholic, known as recusants, who risked fines, harassment, and worse for practicing their faith. He was born into the English gentry, giving him a certain level of education and social standing. From an early age, he was raised in the traditions of the old faith, learning Latin and Catholic doctrine in secret, often at the risk of arrest for his family. This upbringing left him with deep loyalty to the Catholic Church and shaped the path he would choose as an adult. As a young man, Gerard left England to study abroad, joining many other English Catholics who fled to the European continent to train for the priesthood. He attended the English college at Douai, and later went to the Jesuit college in Rome, where he studied intensely and prepared himself for the dangerous mission of returning home to minister to England's secret Catholics. He became a member of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, a new Catholic order famous for its learning, discipline, and absolute loyalty to the Pope. Gerard was ordained as a Jesuit priest and committed to the mission of bringing the sacraments to English Catholics, who are forced to practice in secret. He returned to England at the height of Elizabethan anti-Catholic repression. Catholic priests were hunted as traitors. To harbour one was a capital offence. The government employed spies, informers, and brutal torture to uncover priests and dismantle the secret Catholic networks. Gerard operated in this world of constant danger. He travelled the countryside in disguise, used false names, and relied on a network of recusant families who built secret priest holes in their houses to hide clergy during raids. He celebrated Mass in hidden rooms, heard confessions by candlelight, and encouraged Catholics to hold firm despite the threat of death. He quickly became one of the most famous and hunted priests in England. He was known for his calm courage and his ability to evade capture using careful planning and a remarkable memory for safe routes and secret supporters. He learned to use coded letters, hidden compartments, and sophisticated counter-surveillance to stay ahead of Elizabeth's spies. Despite his skill, he was eventually betrayed and captured. The government recognised him immediately as a high-value target, not just any priest, but one of the leading Jesuit missionaries in England. He was taken to the Tower of London, the most feared prison in the realm, reserved for traitors, rebels, and enemies of the state. Inside the tower, he faced intense interrogation. He was tortured on the rack and subjected to savage forms of physical torment, meant to force him to reveal the names of other priests, his safe houses, and the entire Catholic underground network. But Gerard refused to talk. Even under torture, he denied them the information they wanted. He later wrote about these experiences in detail, describing how he prayed throughout the ordeal and offered his suffering for the perseverance of England's Catholics. His time in the Tower was marked by physical agony, psychological pressure, and a constant awareness that he could be executed at any moment. Yet he maintained his composure, winning the grudging respect of some of his jailers for his unbreakable will. But John Gerard was not resigned to die in prison. Instead, he planned one of the most daring and famous escapes in Elizabethan history. While imprisoned in the Salt Tower, he managed to establish secret communications with Catholic allies outside the walls. He smuggled letters in and out, written in invisible ink made from orange juice, which revealed their message only when held to heat. With their help, he arranged an escape plan that seemed impossible. Using ropes secretly passed to him, he prepared to climb from the tower's walls over the deadly moat. On the appointed night, a boat waited on the Thames. Gerard and another prisoner, John Arden, climbed out of their cell windows, threading the rope carefully down the tower walls. Despite injuries from torture, Gerard managed the climb in darkness, his hands raw and bloody as he lowered himself. The escape was made even more dramatic by the need for perfect timing. Guards patrolled the walls and the river. Any shout, any misstep could mean instant death. But they reached the waiting boat silently and were rowed away into the maze of London's dark waterways, vanishing before the tower's guards realised they were gone. His escape was an enormous embarrassment to Elizabeth's government. Here was one of the most wanted men in England, tortured, shackled, supposedly under the tightest watch in the kingdom, slipping away with audacious calm. After his escape, Gerard went into deep hiding. He continued ministering in secret for a time, helping Catholics who faced renewed crackdowns after events like the Gunpowder Plot, which had hardened Protestant suspicions against them even further. But Gerard knew he was too well known to remain in England forever. Eventually he fled back to the continent, returning to the Jesuit communities that had trained him. There he wrote his famous autobiography, which remains one of the most detailed and vivid accounts of a Catholic missionary's life under persecution in Elizabethan England. His memoir is notable not just for its descriptions of torture and escape, but for its insights into the secret Catholic world of recusant England. He described the hidden chapels, the priest holes, the coded letters, the constant fear of betrayal, and the courage of ordinary families who risked everything to keep their faith alive. John Gerard spent the rest of his life in exile. He continued to work for the Jesuit order, advising English missions from afar, writing letters of spiritual guidance, and maintaining his dedication to the cause of English Catholicism. He died abroad, far from the land he had risked everything to serve, but his legend remained, the priest who refused to break under torture, who evaded England's greatest prison with ingenuity and daring, and who left behind a written testimony to the faith and courage of a persecuted community. John Gerard's life is a story of religious conviction, clandestine resistance, and astonishing bravery. It is the tale of a man who faced the full power of Elizabethan England and refused to yield, choosing instead to slip the chains of the tower itself and live on as a symbol of spiritual defiance. And now for our final story tonight, which is just as interesting as the rest. Casanova's escape. Giacomo Girolamo Casanova was born in 1725 in Venice, one of the most dazzling and decadent cities in Europe. He came into the world in a city of canals and palaces, where masked balls, gambling houses, and secret liaisons were as much a part of daily life as trade and diplomacy. His parents were actors, a profession regarded with suspicion and considered disreputable in polite society. He grew up exposed to the vivid theatrical world of the stage, learning early the art of performance, mimicry, and storytelling. But his childhood was also marked by hardship. His father died young, leaving the family in precarious circumstances. Casanova was sent away to be educated under the care of a wealthy Venetian patron, where he first showed signs of the quick mind and restless energy that would define his life. He was intelligent, gifted with languages, and a voracious reader. He studied for the priesthood at one point, not so much out of piety perhaps, but because it offered a path to education and respectability. But he was unsuited to the discipline and restraint required. He had too great a love of pleasure and independence. As a young man, Casanova roamed Venice's salons and gambling dens. He impressed the city's elites with his wit, learning, and charm. He learned to move effortlessly among nobles, artists, merchants, and courtesans, able to adapt to any audience. But he also fell into scandals. He gambled recklessly, pursued affairs with married women, and took part in duels and intrigues that repeatedly forced him to leave the city. Early on, he began developing the reputation that would follow him forever, that of a notorious lover, a seducer who charmed women across Europe. But he was more than just a libertine. He was also an adventurer, a scholar, and a con man when needed. He studied philosophy, mathematics, and law, and claimed to have read widely in ancient texts. Casanova travelled constantly. He visited France, Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia. He served as a soldier for a time, tried his hand at being a violinist, dabbled in alchemy and occultism, and even posed as a wealthy nobleman or a mystic when it suited him. Everywhere he went, he relied on charm and intelligence to gain entry into elite circles. He could discuss theology with priests, science with scholars, and seduction with libertines. He also used gambling, scams, and borrowed money to fund his journeys, often leaving debts behind him. But in Venice itself, the authorities eventually had enough of his scandals. The city was under the rule of the Council of Ten, a powerful body that kept tight control on public morals and security. Casanova's reputation for seducing married women, corrupting novices in convents, mocking the church, and dabbling in forbidden books earned him their wrath. He was arrested by the Venetian Inquisition and sent to the first Piombi, the notorious prison under the lead-covered roof of the Doge's palace. The prison was infamous for its stifling heat in summer, freezing cold in winter, and near-total darkness. Prisoners were kept in cramped cells with thick iron bars, carefully guarded to prevent escape. Casanova's imprisonment there is one of the most famous episodes of his life. He was accused of blasphemy, witchcraft, spreading forbidden books, and leading a scandalous life. Though he was never formally tried in a modern sense, he was held indefinitely as a danger to public morality. Refusing to give in, Casanova began plotting an escape. He befriended fellow prisoners, bribed guards, and studied the layout of the cells and passages. He managed to obtain a piece of iron, which he sharpened into a tool. Night after night he worked in secrecy to pry up the floorboards and dig through walls. He faced setback after setback. At one point he was moved to another cell. Another time his hiding place for tools was discovered. But he refused to abandon the plan. He built alliances with other prisoners, sharing plans and coordinating their efforts. When the time finally came, he and a companion managed to break through their cell and reach the roof space under the lead covering. They crept silently across beams in total darkness, found their way down through attics and storerooms, and finally emerged inside the Doge's palace itself. Dressed in stolen clothes, they bluffed their way past guards by acting as visiting officials. They slipped through courtyards and chambers, and eventually walked straight out into the city, free men in the cool Venetian night. This escape from the first Piombi became legendary, not just for its boldness, but because it struck at the heart of Venice's reputation for impenetrable justice. Casanova himself would later write about it in detail, describing every moment with the dramatic flair of a born storyteller. After his escape, Venice was closed to him for years. He resumed his wanderings, travelling across Europe. He served as a spy, a diplomat, and an advisor in various courts. He worked briefly for the French government selling state lotteries. He had a celebrated, if controversial, stay at the court of Catherine the Great in Russia. He met and often quarrelled with many of the great figures of his age: Voltaire, Rousseau, Frederick the Great. He made friends and enemies easily, charmed women and offended censors. He wrote essays, translations, and pamphlets on subjects from mathematics to love. In his later years, his fame as a lover began to fade, replaced by debts, disputes, and the wear of constant travel. He lost much of his fortune to gambling and failed investments. Aging, less welcome in courts and salons, he accepted a position as librarian to Count Waldstein in Bohemia. There, in relative isolation, he began writing the work that would secure his immortality, Histoire de ma vie, meaning the story of my life. It was a massive memoir, filled with vivid descriptions of his adventures, affairs, travels, and reflections on society. It is one of the greatest autobiographies of the 18th century, full of detail, scandal, philosophy, and human insight. He died in Bohemia, far from the canals of Venice, but even after death his legend only grew. The name Casanova became a byword for seduction and adventure. His memoirs, though often censored or suppressed, were read and reread, turning him into a symbol of the Age of Enlightenment, brilliant, irreverent, pleasure-loving, and endlessly curious. Yet behind the legend was a real man, intelligent, flawed, bold, and above all restless, a man who refused to be caged, not in his ideas, not in his loves, and not even in the infamous prison cells of the Venetian state. His escape from the first Piombi remains one of the most famous prison breaks in history, an enduring testament to human ingenuity and will. Well, that's the end of tonight's stories. If you're still awake, feel free to get comfortable and stay a little longer. The rain will now begin to fall softly for you. Just relax, breathe, and rest as long as you need.